I remember the exact moment my son decided I was nothing more than a housewife. "Mom, please don't start one of your stories tonight," Daniel said, his voice calm but cold as winter glass. "You're just a housewife. Let the real professionals talk." The table went quiet after that. Silverware paused halfway to mouths. Someone cleared their throat. My daughter-in-law Olivia gave a polite smile to their guests, the kind people use when they hope an awkward moment will disappear if no one looks at it too closely. I looked down at the white tablecloth, smooth as fresh snow, and folded my hands in my lap. I didn't argue. I didn't correct him. At 68 years old, you learn that silence can carry more weight than any speech. The restaurant Daniel chose that evening sat on the 32nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago. From the windows you could see Lake Michigan stretching into the dark, the city lights reflecting on the water like scattered coins. Daniel liked places like that. Places that made people feel important the moment they stepped inside. The kind of place where the host greets you by name and the wine list is thicker than a novel. I wasn't really meant to be there, not in the way the others were. Daniel had invited business partners, investors, and a few well-known doctors from the hospital where he worked as an administrator. I had only been included because, as Olivia put it earlier that week, it looks better if the whole family is present. So I wore my simplest navy dress and the pearl earrings I'd owned for nearly 40 years. No one asked about them. No one asked about anything, really. Conversation moved around me like a river flowing around a quiet stone. They talked about hospital expansions, new medical equipment worth millions of dollars, and conferences in places like San Diego and Boston. Daniel laughed easily with them. Confident. Polished. The same boy who once built toy towers on the living room carpet now spoke about budgets and investors like he'd been born into it. I listened without interrupting. Olivia occasionally glanced at me, as if making sure I remembered my role for the evening. Smile politely. Say little. Don't embarrass anyone. I understood. After all, according to my own son, I was just a housewife. A woman who had spent decades cooking dinners, folding laundry, and waiting by the front window when he came home late from school. A woman whose world, in his mind, had never extended beyond the walls of a quiet suburban home. The waiter refilled glasses. Someone ordered another bottle of wine. Daniel leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the attention from the table. I watched him for a moment and felt something strange settle in my chest. Not anger. Not sadness. Something quieter. Something older. The kind of feeling you get when you realize a story has been misunderstood for a very long time. Then the elevator doors at the far end of the dining room opened, and a tall man in a gray suit stepped inside. He scanned the room slowly, as if searching for someone. When his eyes reached our table, he stopped walking. Completely. His gaze locked on me, and for a moment the entire restaurant seemed to fade into silence. I recognized that look immediately. It was the look people have when a memory returns all at once. The man took a few careful steps toward our table, his expression filled with disbelief, and when he finally spoke his voice was almost a whisper. "Professor Whitmore, is that really you?" For a moment no one at the table moved. Glasses hovered in midair. The quiet hum of the restaurant continued somewhere in the background, but around our table everything felt still. I slowly lifted my eyes toward the man standing beside us. Time had added a few gray strands to his hair and a few lines around his eyes, but I recognized him immediately. Andrew Carter had always had that same thoughtful expression, the look of someone who listened more than he spoke. 30 years earlier he had been a nervous young student who sat in the second row of my lecture hall, always taking careful notes, always staying after class to ask one more question. Now he stood in an expensive suit in the middle of a restaurant on the 32nd floor of a Chicago tower, staring at me as if he had just seen a ghost from his past. Daniel looked from him to me, clearly confused. "Dr. Carter?" Daniel said slowly, trying to understand what was happening. Do you two know each other? Andrew Carter did not answer him right away. His eyes remained fixed on me, searching my face as if confirming a memory that had lived quietly in his mind for decades. Then he let out a small breath of disbelief and shook his head with a soft smile. I cannot believe it, he said. I spent years wondering what happened to you. I felt every pair of eyes at the table shift toward me. Investors. Colleagues. Olivia. Even the waiter who had just approached with another bottle of wine paused beside the table. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his brows tightening. I could see the confusion growing on his face. To him I was simply his mother, the quiet woman who packed school lunches and reminded him to bring a jacket in winter. A housewife. That was the word he had used only minutes earlier. Andrew Carter placed his hand gently on the back of an empty chair but did not sit down yet. His voice was filled with respect that was impossible to miss. Professor Whitmore, he said again, a little louder this time, as if saying the title out loud helped confirm that the moment was real. The name moved through the table like a small ripple through still water. Daniel blinked. Olivia looked at him quickly, then back at me. The investors exchanged glances with one another. I noticed Daniel straighten in his chair, as though he had misheard something important. Professor, he repeated quietly. The word sounded unfamiliar in his mouth. I folded my hands calmly on the table and gave Andrew a small nod. Hello, Andrew, I said. My voice remained steady, the same calm tone I used when greeting an old student after many years. The surprise on his face softened into genuine warmth. You taught half the medical researchers in this city, he said with quiet admiration. I would not be standing here tonight if it were not for you. I noticed Daniel slowly turning his head toward me again. The confidence he had worn all evening began to slip, replaced by something uncertain. It was a look I had never seen on my son before. A look that said he was beginning to realize there might be an entire chapter of my life that he had never known existed. The silence around the table lingered for a few seconds longer than anyone expected. I could almost hear Daniel trying to rearrange the story of his own life. Inside his head. The version where his mother was simply a quiet woman who stayed home, cooked dinners, and kept the house running did not seem to fit the moment anymore. Andrew Carter finally pulled the empty chair back and sat down slowly, still studying my face with the same disbelief. I remember your lectures like they were yesterday, he said. You used to walk into the room carrying that old leather folder, and within 10 minutes everyone in the hall was completely silent. Not because we were afraid. Because we knew we were about to learn something important. One of the investors across the table leaned forward with curiosity. You were a professor, he asked me politely. Daniel looked at me again, this time more carefully, as if trying to find proof of something he had somehow missed for decades. Olivia shifted in her seat but did not say anything. I rested my hands gently on the tablecloth and offered a small, calm smile. A long time ago, I said. Andrew Carter shook his head immediately. Not just any professor, he replied. You led the research program at Northwestern Medical School for years. Some of the best physicians in this city passed through your program. Another guest at the table lifted his eyebrows in surprise. Northwestern, he repeated. Andrew nodded. Yes. Professor Margaret Whitmore built the scholarship initiative that helped students like me stay in school. Without that program I would have had to leave after my first year. His voice carried genuine gratitude, the kind that cannot be faked. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair, processing each word as though it were a new piece of information about a stranger rather than about his own mother. I noticed the moment when his expression changed. It was subtle. A slight tightening of the jaw. The realization that perhaps he had never asked the right questions. Olivia finally cleared her throat softly. Margaret never mentioned that, she said, her tone carefully neutral. I turned my head toward her and answered gently. There were many things happening in those years. Raising a child does not leave much time for long stories. Andrew Carter watched the exchange quietly, and then he spoke again with calm respect. Professor Whitmore left the university very suddenly, he explained to the table. One semester she was there guiding dozens of students, and the next semester she was gone. None of us ever understood why. I could feel the attention of the entire table resting on me now. Daniel's voice came out more quietly than before. You worked at a medical school, he asked, as though the idea still sounded impossible to him. I met his eyes for the first time since the dinner began. There was no anger in my voice when I answered. Only truth. Yes, Daniel, I said softly. Many years ago I did. The city lights shimmered through the tall windows behind us, reflecting on the polished glass of the table. Andrew Carter looked around at the group and then back at me with deep respect. You did not just work there, he said slowly. You changed the direction of many lives. I noticed Daniel swallow quietly, the confidence he had carried earlier in the evening fading with every passing second. For the first time since we sat down for dinner, he looked at me not as the woman who raised him, but as someone he might not fully understand. Daniel did not speak for several seconds. He simply stared at me, the way someone looks at an old photograph after realizing it might have been taken somewhere they never knew existed. Around us the restaurant slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. Plates moved. Glasses touched the table. Conversations resumed at other tables. But at ours the air still felt heavy with the weight of something newly discovered. Andrew Carter leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands together, still smiling with a mixture of respect and disbelief. You were the one who convinced the university to create the Independent Research Fellowship, he continued. Do you remember? At the time people said it would never work. They said students from modest backgrounds could never compete with the traditional programs. I remembered. The long meetings. The quiet arguments in conference rooms that smelled of coffee and old paper. I remembered standing in front of administrators who believed experience belonged only to those who could afford it. I remember, I said calmly. Daniel shifted in his chair. The confidence he had worn earlier in the evening seemed to be dissolving piece by piece. Why did you leave? He asked suddenly. His voice sounded different now. Less certain. Almost careful. Andrew Carter glanced at me before speaking again. No one ever gave us an answer, he said. One day Professor Whitmore was guiding the entire department, and the next day the office door was closed and her name was no longer on the faculty board. The investor sitting beside Daniel gave a small whistle under his breath. You walked away from that, he asked me with clear surprise. I took a moment before answering. Not because the memory was painful. Simply because some stories deserve to be spoken slowly. Life changes, I said gently. Priorities change with it. Daniel lowered his eyes to the tablecloth for a moment. I noticed the way his fingers traced the edge of his glass, a habit he had when he was thinking deeply. He had done the same thing as a child while working through difficult math problems at the kitchen table. Olivia finally spoke again, her voice quieter than before. You never told Daniel about any of this, she asked. I looked at her and smiled softly. Daniel was busy growing up, I said. Children do not always ask about the years that came before them. Andrew Carter nodded slowly as if he understood something important in that sentence. You were not just a professor, he said thoughtfully. You were the reason many of us believed we belonged in medicine at all. Daniel lifted his head again and looked directly at me. The earlier certainty in his expression had been replaced by something else entirely. Something closer to doubt. Something closer to curiosity. Mom, he said quietly, almost as if the word had suddenly taken on a different meaning, how come I never knew any of this? I held his gaze calmly. There was no accusation in my voice when I answered. Because you never asked, I said simply. The words settled over the table with surprising weight. Andrew Carter looked between us and then gave a soft, thoughtful smile. It seems tonight we are all learning something new, he said. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, still looking at me as if trying to understand a version of his mother that had existed long before he was old enough to notice. And for the first time that evening, the room no longer saw me as the quiet woman who had been sitting politely at the end of the table. They were beginning to see someone else entirely. The quiet around the table deepened after my last words. Because you never asked. Daniel did not respond right away. He looked down again at the polished glass surface of the table, as if the reflection there might help him piece together something that had been missing from his understanding for years. I watched him the same way I used to watch him when he was a boy trying to solve a puzzle at the kitchen table, turning the pieces slowly until they finally made sense. Andrew Carter broke the silence gently. You know, he said, glancing around the table, Professor Whitmore once stayed in the lab with our research group for 3 straight nights while we were preparing a major presentation. Most faculty members would have simply reviewed the results and sent us on our way. She worked beside us the entire time. One of the investors looked impressed. 3 nights, he asked. Andrew nodded with a small smile. She believed the work mattered. More importantly, she believed the students mattered. His voice held the kind of respect that grows only after many years of reflection. Daniel slowly lifted his head again and studied my face with new attention, as if he were searching for traces of the person Andrew Carter described. Perhaps he was trying to connect that image with the woman who had once waited in the car outside his middle school during winter afternoons, the engine running so the heater would keep the inside warm while he finished basketball practice. The same woman who had stayed up late helping him prepare for science exams. The same woman who had packed sandwiches every morning for nearly 12 years. Olivia finally spoke again, but her tone had changed. The earlier edge of polite superiority had softened into something closer to curiosity. So you were teaching medical research before Daniel was born, she asked. I nodded slightly. Yes, I said. Long before. Andrew Carter leaned forward with quiet enthusiasm. You should have seen her lectures, he added. She had this ability to explain complex problems in ways that made everyone in the room feel capable of solving them. Another guest laughed softly. That sounds like the kind of professor students never forget. Andrew smiled in agreement. Exactly. Daniel shifted again in his seat. The confident posture he had carried earlier was gone now. In its place was something uncertain, something thoughtful. Mom, he said slowly, choosing his words more carefully than before, you really ran the research fellowship program? I nodded once more. For several years, I replied calmly. The waiter approached quietly to clear a few plates, sensing the unusual tension at the table but saying nothing. Daniel leaned back slightly and ran a hand through his hair, the way he often did when a meeting at work did not go the way he expected. I had no idea, he admitted under his breath. Andrew Carter looked at him kindly. Most people did not, he said. She never spoke about it much. That was true. I had never felt the need to explain every chapter of my life. Some decisions belong to their moment in time. Daniel finally looked directly at me again, his expression no longer confident or dismissive. Instead, there was something far more honest in his eyes now. Why did you stop? He asked quietly. The question lingered between us for a moment. I noticed Andrew Carter watching me with the same curiosity as the others at the table. They were all waiting for the same answer. I folded my hands calmly in my lap and looked at my son with the steady patience that comes only after many years. Because something more important needed my time, I said gently. Daniel frowned slightly, clearly trying to understand what I meant. But the truth was already sitting right in front of him, and he was only beginning to see it. Daniel's question stayed in the air like a quiet echo. Why did you stop? The others at the table waited, their attention moving between us as if the answer might explain everything that had happened during the last 20 minutes. I looked at my son carefully. For the first time that evening he was not speaking to me like a child correcting his mother. He was speaking like a man trying to understand a stranger. Because something more important needed my time, I had said, and now the meaning of those words slowly began to settle over the table. Daniel leaned forward slightly. More important than leading a research program, he asked. His voice carried honest confusion now. In his world, positions like that were the peak of a career. The kind of role people spent decades trying to reach. I nodded once, calmly. Yes, I said. Much more important. Andrew Carter watched the exchange quietly. I noticed the moment when understanding began to form in his eyes. He turned his head toward Daniel with a thoughtful expression. How old are you? He asked him gently. Daniel blinked, surprised by the question. 40, he answered. Andrew nodded slowly, doing the quiet math in his head. That explains it, he said. The year Professor Whitmore left the university was the same year our department heard she had moved away from Chicago for a while. I folded my hands together and looked out toward the tall windows where the lights of the city shimmered against the dark water of the lake. The memory returned easily. A small apartment. A newborn crying at 3 in the morning. Medical journals sitting unopened on a desk while a bottle warmer hummed softly on the kitchen counter. Daniel followed Andrew's reasoning and then turned back toward me, his expression changing again. You left because of me, he said quietly. It was not really a question. It sounded more like a realization that had arrived too late. I did not rush to answer. Some truths deserve a moment of silence before they are spoken. Finally, I nodded once more. Yes, I said gently. The table fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It was no longer curiosity. It was reflection. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, staring at the table as though the entire evening had suddenly taken on a new shape. The investors who had been so lively earlier now watched quietly, sensing they were witnessing something personal that had nothing to do with business. Olivia shifted beside him but did not speak. Andrew Carter gave a small, respectful nod, as if confirming a story he had long suspected but never known for certain. You gave up a remarkable career, he said softly. I shook my head with a calm smile. No, I replied. I chose a different one. Daniel looked up again at those words. His expression had softened, the earlier pride replaced by something closer to humility. And you never told me, he said. I met his eyes steadily across the table. Daniel, I answered quietly, raising you was never something I considered a sacrifice. My words settled quietly over the table, and for a long moment no one spoke. The restaurant lights reflected softly in the glass windows behind Daniel, turning the city skyline into a quiet sea of gold and silver. Daniel looked down again, his shoulders no longer carrying the same confidence he had when the evening began. It was the posture of someone revisiting old memories and seeing them differently for the first time. I do not remember you ever mentioning the university, he said slowly. His voice was thoughtful now, almost careful, as if each word needed to pass through a new understanding before leaving his mouth. I gave a small, calm smile. Children remember what happens around them, I said gently. They do not always see what was set aside for them. Andrew Carter nodded slightly, clearly recognizing the truth in that sentence. He turned toward Daniel with a quiet seriousness. Your mother changed the course of many lives, he said. Mine included. When I started medical school, I could barely afford the textbooks. The fellowship program she created allowed students like me to stay. Without it, I would not have made it through the first year. Daniel listened without interrupting. His eyes shifted between Andrew and me, absorbing every detail as if he were hearing the story of someone entirely new. Olivia folded her hands on the table and looked at me with a different expression now. The earlier politeness had faded, replaced by something more reflective. You must have loved that work, she said softly. I thought about the long lecture halls, the quiet concentration of young students filling notebooks with ideas that might one day save lives. I thought about the excitement in a classroom when a difficult concept suddenly made sense. Yes, I answered honestly. I did. Daniel finally looked up again, his gaze steady but no longer dismissive. Then why never go back, he asked. After I was older. After things became easier. It was a reasonable question. Many people at the table seemed to wonder the same thing. I took a moment before responding, not because the answer was difficult, but because it was simple. Because by then my work had already done what it was meant to do, I said calmly. Andrew Carter smiled faintly at that. You built something that continued without you, he added with admiration. The fellowship program still exists. Hundreds of students have passed through it. I noticed Daniel straighten slightly in his chair at that information. It is still running, he asked. Andrew nodded. Very successfully. The quiet pride in his voice filled the space between us. Daniel looked back at me slowly. For years he had believed he understood the full story of the woman who raised him. Now he was realizing that the chapters he remembered were only part of a much larger book. I met his eyes without anger or disappointment. Only patience. Finally he spoke again, his voice softer than it had been all evening. Mom, he said carefully, I think there is a lot about you that I never really knew. I gave a gentle nod. That is true, I replied. Then I looked around the table at the group who had come here expecting an ordinary business dinner and said quietly, but sometimes the most important parts of a person's life are the ones they choose not to announce. The table remained quiet after my last sentence, but it was no longer the uncomfortable silence from earlier in the evening. This silence felt thoughtful, almost respectful. The investors who had come expecting to discuss contracts and hospital expansion plans now seemed far more interested in the unexpected story unfolding in front of them. Daniel sat very still. I could see the change in him clearly. The sharp confidence he had worn like a jacket earlier in the night had faded. In its place was something more honest. Something closer to humility. He slowly reached for his glass of water but did not drink. Instead he turned the glass slightly between his fingers, the same small habit he had when he was younger in trying to understand something complicated. I think I spent most of my life assuming I already knew who you were, he said quietly. His voice was no longer defensive. It carried the careful tone of someone admitting a mistake without saying the word directly. I looked at him calmly across the table. That happens more often than people realize, I said gently. Andrew Carter gave a thoughtful nod beside him. It is easy to believe we understand the people closest to us, he added. Especially when they never ask for recognition. Daniel exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair, staring briefly toward the tall windows where the city lights stretched across the dark water of Lake Michigan. I remember you helping me with science projects when I was in middle school, he said after a moment. You always seemed to know exactly how to explain things. A small smile appeared on my face. I remember those projects too, I said softly. You built a solar system model out of painted foam balls in our kitchen. Daniel let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. I forgot about that, he admitted. Olivia watched the exchange carefully. Her expression had softened considerably since the beginning of the evening. That explains a lot, she said thoughtfully. Daniel always said his interest in hospital administration came from growing up around medical conversations. Daniel looked at her and then back at me again. I suppose those conversations were not random after all, he said slowly. Andrew Carter leaned forward slightly. Your mother was one of the most respected educators I ever met, he said. The kind of professor who believed that knowledge should open doors for others. Daniel listened without interrupting. Then he finally spoke again, more quietly than before. I wish I had known that sooner. I studied his face carefully. There was no anger in me, only the quiet understanding that comes with time. Daniel, I said gently, every person learns the truth about others in their own moment. The waiter approached again to refill a few glasses, glancing at our table with subtle curiosity before stepping away. Daniel sat silently for another few seconds before lifting his eyes to meet mine again. The earlier distance between us had faded. In its place was something new. Something uncertain, but sincere. "Mom," he said slowly, "I think tonight I am realizing something important." I tilted my head slightly, inviting him to continue. He hesitated for a brief moment before finishing the thought. "I might have misunderstood you for a very long time." Daniel's words hung gently in the air between us, and for a moment I simply watched him. The young man sitting across the table looked very different from the confident host who had welcomed everyone earlier that evening. There was something thoughtful in his expression now, something quieter. I folded my hands on the table and gave him a calm smile. "Understanding people takes time," I said softly. "Sometimes a lifetime." Daniel nodded slowly as if that sentence carried more meaning than he had expected. The lights of the restaurant reflected in his eyes as he looked down at the table again. "When I said earlier that you were just a housewife," he began carefully, "I thought I was describing reality." His voice was steady, but the tone was reflective rather than defensive. "Now I realize I was only describing the small part of your life that I happened to see." Andrew Carter leaned back slightly in his chair and allowed a quiet smile to appear. "That is an important realization," he said gently. "Many people never reach it." Olivia shifted beside Daniel and looked toward me with a thoughtful expression. "It must have been difficult," she said softly, "to watch your own achievements disappear from view." I shook my head slowly. "They did not disappear," I answered calmly. "They simply changed shape." The group listened carefully. I could see that the conversation had moved far beyond the dinner plans they originally came here to discuss. "When you build something that helps others," I continued, "it does not matter if your name remains attached to it forever. What matters is that it continues working." Andrew Carter nodded again, clearly understanding the philosophy behind those words. Daniel looked up at me once more, and this time there was genuine respect in his gaze. "You could have told me," he said quietly. "You could have reminded me who you were when I spoke earlier." I considered that for a moment before responding. "I could have," I admitted. "But some lessons are stronger when people discover them on their own." Daniel absorbed that answer slowly. Then he pushed his chair back a few inches from the table and sat up straighter. The change in posture was small but noticeable. "I think tonight has shown me something important," he said. "Not just about you, but about the way I see people." I listened without interrupting. The investors at the table also remained silent, giving him the space to finish his thought. "I built my career believing that success was measured by titles and recognition," Daniel continued. "But the work you did helped hundreds of students become doctors, and most of them probably never even met you." Andrew Carter gave a quiet laugh of agreement. "That is true," he said. "But every one of us benefited from what she created." Daniel looked back at me again, and this time the distance that had existed between us earlier in the evening was gone completely. "Mom," he said slowly, "I think the person I underestimated the most tonight was the one who raised me." I held his gaze with the same calm patience I had carried all evening. Then I offered a gentle smile and said quietly, "Daniel, the most important thing is not how people see you at the beginning of the conversation. It is how they see you by the time they finally understand."